Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Infirmary, where I and my guests try to help all of you guys not get injured and perform at your best. And I'm super stoked today that I've got another one of my big coach crushes, Ryan Bolton, on the show, who I've known for a few years now. But Ryan, a lot of you probably know him as a coach, but also has a profound sporting background himself. He was one of our first Olympians at the 2000 Sydney Olympics, and he ran cross country and track at the University of Wyoming, where he was an All-American and an All-Academic. He is your 2002 Ironman Lake Placid champion, and then stayed in the sport until 2004, which is when he retired from long course racing and has been coaching ever since. At the moment, he coaches America's top-ranked Olympic athlete, John Reed, and has coached or worked with in some capacity Ben Hoffman, who was on the show and many of you know very well, Caroline Rotich, who was the winner of the 2015 Boston Marathon, Coach Sam Long for the first 4 years of Sam's career, and Morgan Pearson, the 2024 Olympian. Right now, Ryan serves as the director of his company, Bolton Endurance Sports Training, and the director of high performance at USA Triathlon. He also founded and directed the Harambe Project, a group of elite endurance runners that are based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's a lot. Ryan, welcome to the Infirmary.
I feel like that's the way the world works today, though, right? We all have to wear, well, I guess all those hats are in the same realm, but there are a lot of hats for sure.
It's true. I mean, I'm going to go off script right away. Like, why do you say that? Why do you feel like we all have to wear a lot of hats these days in the coaching and in endurance world?
Well, I mean, honestly, I mean, for me, maybe it's a bit more personal, but it's to accomplish like I love the balance of working with the, age group athletes that I work with. And honestly, a lot of what I learn from them and working with them keeps me sharp and relevant for the other athletes that I love working with, which are my professionals and everything. And my professionals, it's very like it's conventional coaching. It's kind of like having an NBA team. You know what I mean? I'm with them on a daily basis, like almost year round, because we're in a daily environment, which I really enjoy that. Like, honestly, when it comes to coaching, I would say my favorite thing is probably like standing on a pool deck or standing out the track. You know what I mean? The actual
Totally.
physical like coaching component. But so it kind of adds that component to, like I said, the joy that I get from training my age group athletes, which a lot of them are obviously remote. So, and online and everything. Yeah, like I said, it's a balance. And, yeah, and sometimes I would say the pendulum, kind of swings like back and forth at, by certain weeks and certain days and where my time is spent and everything. But it's an awesome balance that has taken some time to get to and also has taken some time to balance
Yeah.
properly. Yeah.
And what are some of the aspects? I think most people think about coaches who work in daily training environments, and what they think is they see you on deck, they see you at the track, and it's like, what are the other elements? Because same here, right? Like nothing is better than standing on a pool deck or working with an athlete
Right.
one to one. But what's some of the other stuff that you have to do in order to maintain a daily training environment?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like by the time you're on the pool deck, it's kind of like doing a test, you know what I mean? Like, or like studying for a test. By the time you've got to the test that takes an hour, there's 40 hours that went into that. And I think like that moment when you're saying on the pool deck is like, it's almost like that, you know what I mean? The front end, both the like planning the training, of course, and like periodizing it and planning it over time and all that stuff. But also like to know that you need, 5 lanes reserved at a certain, just the complete logistical component, 5 lanes reserved at this time on this day 4 months ago is like there's logistical planning for that too. Who's going to be in town, how many people are going to be in town. And like this morning, we'll use the pool deck as an example is, we have our group swims multiple times a week, but it's almost because I'm in Tucson right now. And it's almost like we have guests every week, it seems like. And I honestly even plan that. Like, I'm like, okay, we need 5 lanes because like, I know that I'm going to have these 12 athletes there, but inevitably there's going to be 3 other people who just happen to call and be like, hey, I'm in town right now. Can I swim with you guys? And so that happens. But there's just, I would say, both the logistical planning, but the training planning that actually gets you to that moment where you're sitting like on the pool deck or at the track or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've got some questions for you later on about like the bigger picture and larger perspective of preparing an athlete over years. And I think that's probably a place where we can come back and to tie that into that. But, as I said in the intro, like people probably know you as a coach, but you were an Olympian and you're an Ironman champion. What did you carry from that part of your career when you were an athlete into the work you do now as a coach?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a firm believer in that you don't have to be a brilliant athlete to be a brilliant coach. And in fact, I feel like a lot of professional level athletes would not make very good coaches at all. I was lucky that when I quit racing, my coach and mentor was Joe Friel, who's an amazing person and an amazing coach and obviously written a lot of books and everything. And he kind of like embraced me and asked me to get into the coaching world, which I'm glad he saw that like that was something that maybe like I would be interested in or do well at because like I fortunately, it's hard coming from being a professional athlete and finding something that you're equally as passionate about, like as being an athlete, I mean, that's the great thing about being a professional athlete. You wake up every day, you have an insanely concrete goal for both the day, but also the month and the year, et cetera. And like in life, I mean, I think it's kind of hard to find that. Like, it's not that easy to, like wake up with that much passion every day. And like, luckily, right away when I started coaching, I was like, this like satisfies that and more because I feel like it's me and someone else and a whole team of people ultimately like working for like something bigger where honestly, as an athlete, like I kind of struggled with like the absolute like selfish self-centeredness of it. Cause you are as
Totally.
an athlete, it was like, you were very like it was very self-centered. But I mean, I think, the knowledge, like knowing what the athletes are going through, knowing what they're thinking, like relating to them and understanding that I think is huge. Cause to me, that's a huge part of coaching is like, actually being able to read them, to talk to them, to understand what they're thinking and feeling. And there's like, I mean, all the athletes that I coach, like none of them are identical. And certainly they're not identical to me and everything, but like learning that piece of it. And when you can see some pieces of you and what you were going through during that time, I think there is a lot of value like in that and everything. And just honestly too, like in both short course and long course racing, just having the experience with the races, although the dynamics of those races have changed since I raced. I mean, last time I raced
Mhm.
was 2003. And I mean, it's changed tremendously. You know what I mean? But I've been involved with the sport since then. And so I've watched those changes, but I can understand like the dynamics of the race and the season, sponsors, those relationships, those obligations, like all of that. And I think that's like the value, but kind of going back to my initial point, I don't think that's absolutely necessary. I'd like to be a great coach. Some of the best coaches I know are not like even former athletes. And I mean, you look at that in every sport, you know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Yeah.
It's pretty common actually in in a lot of other sports that, great coaches weren't necessarily, awesome athletes in their own right.
And then go in the other direction, like if you could say something to like, 1999 Ryan, but you're the coach, like
Oh man,
what 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 are the things that you would urge him to change in his approach to training and racing?
man, so much. And that's not to discredit my coach. Like, I think he was coaching me brilliantly at the time. I think, like, I mean, and honestly, too, like on the actual physicality coaching, the physiological side of coaching, not much. I mean, I would modify maybe this and that a little bit more just because I understand my own physiology more at this point, and I probably understand what like I could have maybe benefited like slightly from more, which that could have come from one person, ultimately me. But I think like I mean, geez, patience. Like I would have told myself to be more patient. I would have told myself to be more professional. I always struggled with the idea and the concept of like, is this fun? Am I like having like, is this like I'm like, it's just sport, you know what I mean? Like I look at the people around me who ultimately were really successful and even more successful, like long term. And they really approached it like it was a job. And I wish I would have approached it a little more professionally than I did at the time. And I try to like help my athletes now that I coach, like have that perspective and because like I learned from that ultimately and everything. But yeah, just being more patient with the process and like believing in my process and like myself. I think those are a lot of things that I could have told myself and just, yeah, having, I don't know if you want to call it just like, independence from like the entire like world of triathlon, like you get so like in the middle of it and everything. And I wish that I could have like taken a step back every once in a while and like looked into it from an outside perspective and been like, oh, this is like, this is what you need to do. And this was what looks good and, all that stuff.
I'm interested to hear you talk about, you just said that you work with your athletes in that same way of trying to get them to see the big picture and like focus on the process in the way that, you wish you had. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I think we struggle with as coaches is this whole like, gosh, I know what I would have done differently then.
Eh.
And how do you communicate the correct information to your athletes without sort of projecting like your experience on top of them?
Right. No, totally. Yeah. Well, and I think there's times where I actually do project my experience and I tell them that, I'm like, this is coming from, if I could have told my 24-year-old self this, I would have, so that's why I'm telling you this right now, because I want you to see that. But I think also like probably more important than that is like every athlete is different, and learning the language that works with that athlete and what motivates them and what drives them. And also, and honestly, just how to convey, the messaging to them in the most effective way. And I do think like using what you just said as an example, like, if I would have been in my experience, I've learned this, like some athletes, like that really works. And other athletes, they'd be like, well, can you put that into my perspective or something like that? And I think like just knowing how to convey that message, which like you said, it's kind of interesting. Like, you're working with, like 12 athletes in the same day at the same time. They all 12 have slightly different needs, like psychologically, emotionally, even physically, and trying to make sure that all of those needs are met are like really important. And like I always say this about coaching in that capacity too, is like the physiology is kind of the easy part. You know what I mean? That's in textbooks. We can study that, we can read that. The coaching part, I think, is often like overlooked in the importance of like that actual being a coach and being there for advice for a person and also adapting for people to give them the needs, that they need to be the best athlete that they can be, because it looks differently for everyone, really.
Can you give me two examples? You don't have to name names, but just two
Yeah.
different examples of like different approaches of, and what I'm basically asking here is like, how do you figure out what the best approach is for athlete A versus B?
Yeah.
Like what does that
Yeah, for
process look
sure.
like for you?
It takes time. I mean, I think it takes time because you have to get to know the athlete. And I mean, I'm gonna use an incredibly generic example, like for what you just said, is like, there's some athletes that are very, it's much more of like an emotional, like conversation, and if you can incorporate that like into it, whereas and understanding, getting to understand them and like their, what they do, get like positive reinforcement from, and others. And like an example of that is like some athletes, like you can be, that was great, good job, you did an amazing job, and that lifts them up. Other athletes, you could say the same thing and it doesn't, because they're like, I know what good is and you're full of crap. I know that wasn't good. So you just telling me that I'm a hero and I had a great day, like actually makes me lose confidence in you, because I know what's good. I know what's not good. As other people, like they might hear that no matter what, when they hear that, like it's a positive thing. You know what I mean? So I think like knowing those two athletes, like some athletes want it real. They want it, straight up. They want it direct, because then they know. And that's a big philosophy of mine, is like, I normally don't candy coat stuff. You know what I mean? Because I've learned that with athletes, like you want to be like, I want to be real with them, because that instills long-term trust. Because once again, if you just tell them that everything's great and everything's rosy and, all that stuff, and like, just kind of like flushing over like the difficult stuff, then it ultimately doesn't lead to like that much good feedback and or that great a relationship. But some athletes do thrive on that, like, more like emotionally charged stuff, whereas other athletes are a lot more like, cut and dry, and like, I want to know the science behind this, for example, or why are we doing this exact thing, as other people just want to be like, do you care about my success? And kind of like, finding that balance with every athlete and creating that relationship with every athlete, which is, I mean, it's a big thing too. And I mean, and I'll admit, and I think every coach should, is like, I mean, there's some athletes who like I just wouldn't be a good fit for.
Mhm.
Absolutely. You know what I mean? As a coach, and and vice versa and everything. But it's so much fun when you do find athletes that you really learn to work with and communicate with and get, because then I feel like we all like, can go to the highest level.
Yeah. Well, you're down in Tucson right now with 12 of your athletes, that you work with, like mostly professionals, and then you said there is an age grouper who's down there, and then
Yeah.
other professionals from other groups kind of drop in and out, and
Yeah, for sure.
you and I were talking before we started recording. I mean, that's a lot of different kind of physical, intellectual, and emotional profiles to
Yeah, it
keep
is.
track of. Like, so I guess this is two questions, kind of like what we were talking about what do you think sets up athletes for success at training camps?
Mm.
And then the second one is like, do you keep a journal about like your different athletes, like physical, intellectual, emotional profiles? Like, how do you keep that front of mind so you're always like, oh, athlete J needs this? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious
I'll
about what
start
that
with
looks
that one
like.
is you do keep notes on athletes, but honestly, like those notes are often like front end, you know what I mean? And you can kind of like learn an athlete like pretty like quickly in that regard if you're paying attention and you have kind of that like emotional like intelligence or whatever you want to call that, which I think is important, but you have like once again you have to dive into that. You have to address that like pretty early on. As far as training camps go, like I feel there's so much value of training in a group. And with me and my group, like we, it's very important for me that the people that come into the group have like a growth mindset and that they see other people in the group as whether they're better, stronger athletes or not quite as fast or not quite as developed or whatever as like potential like assets and allies like to them and everything because like I said I've had athletes come into the group who do not have that growth mindset who are totally intimidated by other people even if they're as good of an athlete and they just cower in those conditions and they don't thrive and they don't survive and which is okay for me because I feel like I have a good idea of what it takes to be really good. And in my experience, the athletes that do really thrive at the top level embrace those environments and take advantage of them and really all that. It's funny because like we'll use Ben Hoffman as an example because I know you know him pretty well and I've coached him for many, 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 many years. Ben's a great guy in that like he was long course. And so he like when I first started working with him, we didn't always have so many people here, but Ben utilized every resource and every person in his periphery, and just these pro cyclists happen to be in town this week. Guess who I'm riding with this week? These pro cyclists, you know what I mean? He always wanted to put himself up against and with the top level guys because he knew that led to growth and he was totally okay because he knew the value of actually getting his butt kicked was like incredibly, it raised his game, you know what I mean? And I think like in my group, I really try to preach that with the athletes and like, for them to embrace that and it does, then it's kind of the rising tide type of thing. But I've lost athletes for that very reason because they haven't been, they're like, whoa, that intimidates me. It freaks me out. And I'm like, it's okay. And you're maybe not a great fit for an environment like this, if that's the case. And, which is fine. But, anyway, I do think but that dynamic too is, it's inevitable. Like when you do have a lot of athletes training together, is like some of them become, like the best of friends. It's kind of like going through war with people. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Because it
totally.
is the training's really hard and all that stuff. And I would say everyone, like in our group, they're friends. Some of them are incredibly good friends. You know what I mean? And that inevitably like happens well. But I love seeing that part of it, and that's like a whole other conversation about like how, I mean, this sounds kind of hokey and like I'm an elementary school, softball coach or something. But like for me, it is important also. Like I love watching the athletes grow as athletes, but like probably more so as like people and humans because they are like, I mean, this career is going to be pretty short for them and everything. And it's fun. Like when athletes quit working with me and they retire or whatever, like knowing that I've seen them grow so much as a person and, all that stuff. I mean, that I can say like, I've worked with a lot of East African runners and I really see that with them because they're coming, often when I see them, they're coming from East Africa and their like knowledge of like the world, especially like the Western world, like is pretty limited and it's fun because in, an X amount of time, like I see them just like grow and become like completely like different people and yeah, which is that's so much fun to watch.
Yeah, when we were talking, you said before you said you really like working with athletes who you think the athletes who thrive are the ones who embrace all aspects of their development, physical, intellectual, and emotional.
For
And
sure.
we were talking about the fact that the physical part is like, yeah, that's like
Yeah.
the base ticket to admission. How do you
Yeah.
work with an athlete in terms of those other two pillars? Like I would say intellectual is like thinking and emotional is like feeling. Like, what
Yeah.
does that look like for an athlete who works with you?
Yeah. Well, like we've said here is I think the physical part of it's easy. Like if you go, especially in the sport of triathlon and really endurance sports is like 0.9% of elite athletes, you can throw training at them and they're absolutely 100% willing to do the work. You don't get, I found in this sport, you don't really get lazy people. Or it's very rare that I would like have a professional athlete that I was working with that wants to do less work. Most of them want to do more work and everything. So I think like that's the easy, like it's actually easy, that piece of it and everything. I do think getting people, and this is just what I found. And I think my work with USA Triathlon has been really valuable because I've got to work with a bunch of athletes, like a lot of our national team level athletes, that some of them I've coached and some of them I don't coach. And you get to see like different coaching styles and everything and like, and how that works and what their relationships are with their coaches and the training plans and stuff. But I think most importantly, what I've noticed and what I've like really realized and I try to implement with my own athletes now is that what you said is it's what makes the most successful athletes they're all motivated. They all train hard. Like that's check. So they've got that box checked, of course, but is facing all of the other things and all the other challenges and setting up that team of people and, getting over those humps. And I see athletes like, they're not willing. It's just kind of like life in general, but they're not willing to like look in the mirror and
Hmm.
really address, what is really, the elephant in the closet, like what's really like going to get me over that next hump. And like you said, and that's creating up a team around you, like sports psychologists and even like nutritionists and, just everything. Like I found, like I said, the most successful athletes are the athletes who are like, I want to check that box. How do I check it? How do I check it in the most professional manner? And like I said, athletes that I've worked with and athletes that like I haven't worked with. And like it's fun and it's so much fun to work with those athletes because same thing, I'll use the same term, is they have these tremendous growth mindsets. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
They're not afraid to fail to get better. And they're not afraid to be uncomfortable, like mentally and
Hmm.
emotionally comfortable to fail. Like I said, all of them are totally ready to be physically uncomfortable. But that emotional and intellectual, like that's kind of I would say that's the difference maker that's like the thing that really, that puts people like on the podium and not just on the podium, but on the podium consistently. And I think that's a important distinction. I've seen athletes who aren't capable of like I said, like looking in the mirror, like
Hmm.
have incredibly good races, but they're not capable of having incredibly good races over and over and over and over again. You know what I mean? Because they're incredibly talented athletes. So I think working on like those things with the athletes, like you said, and I think oddly, like in coaching, it's a little bit maybe what's overlooked the most, like I
Hmm.
said, people love you go to conferences and like, 90% of the presentations are about, VO2 max and lactate testing and, and, stuff like that. So yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
hold on one sec. Hold on one
Sure.
sec.
Totally.
Okay, sorry about that.
Nice. Doing some
People just
audio
walked in the house.
hygiene. I
I
love
had
it.
to tell them that I was like actually recording.
That was great. Like clearly somebody was singing in the background. That was sort of cute. Yeah. So yeah, I totally see that. And like that's something I have with like a lot of my athletes too. They're sort of champion box checkers a lot of the time.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like, and I can see, there's sort of two directions where it can go. And I think a lot of the athletes that you're talking about, where the box checking goes in a positive direction, where they're like,
yeah,
where can I get the help? Where can I like put myself in these situations? I'm sure you've seen this. Have you ever seen an athlete who is checking boxes in a way that sort of makes you worried, where you're like, the point here seems to be checking boxes rather
yeah.
than actually getting better? And if so, how did you handle that?
Yeah, and or checking the boxes for the wrong reasons, you know what I mean? Because it's like because it is a box to check or something, and they have some belief that almost like checking that box makes it so they can ignore that really, really important box over there. Because they're like, look at how good I'm checking this box, you know what I mean? And how consistently. And I'll be like, well, what about that other box? They're like, yeah, let's not talk about that other important. I mean, I think like that is a challenge because like I mean, obviously, well, the first part of that is you recognizing that as a coach. And I mean, sometimes that's a tough step, you know what I mean? You have to, cause you actually have to like look, but then the second piece of it is like getting them to recognize that, you know what I mean? And framing it kind of like what we were talking about before is like with different athletes, like how do you frame that? You know, with some athletes, you can sit down and be like, hey man, I totally notice this box that you're totally avoiding. Let's discuss that. You know what I mean? And those are the types there's sometimes they're like, you're right, let's talk about it. And normally that's the easy conversation, right? But the ones who like, no, that box totally isn't over there. And you're like, yeah, no, I can see you can see it. And they're like, yeah, but no, we're just going to kind of ignore that. And in fact, I'm going to argue with you about how that box totally does not exist, you know? And I think like, that's like, it's hard, but like, but yeah, I think that's like part of coaching too, is getting the athletes like to like try to, you know, see that and, you know, and accomplish that. And it's a pretty easy way out to not, you know, have those hard conversations and everything. It's kind of like life. I mean, those conversations sometimes are difficult, but like if you can see that, then you see the growth, and that's super rewarding on both sides of the, you know, the coach and the athlete.
What are some ways that you have experienced that situation? An athlete who is like, "Oh, that box over there doesn't exist." And again, I don't need specifics, but like,
Yeah.
what is your when you hear that and you're like, "This athlete is trying to ignore that box over there." What do you do to try to, come at them from another angle to help them see that they're ignoring a box?
Yeah. And I think that's just it, is like trying to understand who they are, you know, as a person, and kind of like what is the best messaging for that, you know, and everything. And that's hard, honestly. I mean, for me, sometimes that's hard because I'm just like, just look, it's right there.
It's right there.
And especially, you know, if they're like arguing with you about, you know, be like, no, it's totally not there. And I'm going to, you know, absolutely. I mean, I think it is like just finding the right messaging. And I mean, inevitably it is like a lot of time, maybe it takes, you know, repetition or, like I said, the right message. And I mean, it's kind of like having a conversation with a difficult person. And you're like, okay, you know, maybe this is the way that it's going to work. Maybe, you know, and then when you hit it, you're like, got it, you know, got it figured out. But also I can say, I mean, concretely, is there sometimes it's just that they're not willing to hear that message. And I think that's the difference too, is like I said, and I would say that oftentimes those athletes or, you know, individuals that no matter how you come at them to try to give them that message, they're not willing to hear it. Like like for me, it's kind of a bummer because, but I'm like, well, you know, ultimately, I don't think they're going to be as successful as they possibly can be, and which is unfortunate. You know what I mean? But like I said, the athletes who are willing, you know, to like I said, face those demons, et cetera, like are the ones who like really, really rise and, you know, and become, and this is like at every level, you know what I mean? Like this is at every level of athlete, you know, my most successful age group athletes are the ones who they do, once again, have that growth mindset. They're like, you know, I want to learn. I want to learn from mistakes. I realize that, you know, every day can't be a great day. And, you know, and they're willing to, you know, take a step backward to take two steps forward. Yeah.
That. So you've coached, but you both raced short course and you've raced long course.
Yeah.
You've coached short course, you've coached long course. You know, you've done a lot of different things. You know, you've coached elite runners, you've coached
Yeah.
triathletes. So what lies at the sort of foundation of your kind of physical approach to coaching? You know,
Yeah.
like if you were to go out on a limb and be like, the one tool that I absolutely cannot remove from my physical coaching toolbox is
Yeah.
blank.
Foundation and consistency.
What does that mean? Tell me
Well,
more about those.
I would say periodization, foundation, consistency. Well, periodizing the schedule no matter what. And both, when I'm like talking about periodization on a multi-year level. So we're talking about, you know, what's year one look like versus year 10, but also periodization, obviously yearly periodization, weekly or monthly, weekly, and everything. So like actually structuring an athlete to set up, you know, you have an athlete who, I've been coaching for 10 years, who is doing long course racing. Like I know, they've got a great foundation. Their periodization is going to look differently than, an athlete who is brand new, like an athlete brand new. But that foundation, like building that core foundation is like, to me, absolutely critical. Aerobic base, that is critical. And so once again, you get a young 18-year-old, it's pretty easy because you're like, okay, they don't have much foundation. I can really build on that for a while. You get a person who's coming to you, and let's use an age group athlete, who's 40 years old, who's like, I'm coming from, I played soccer. And soccer's a bad example. I came from martial arts or something, and you're like, great. I know that I'm going to get the most bang out of the buck from them by doing like foundation work for strength work and like really building that aerobic base and everything. Because they probably like don't have that. And then consistency is, I would say, the key to success with all of that is just making sure that week in, week out, like building, staying healthy is such a big thing. And I mean, that's kind of simple because I think like it gets much more complicated, but I do feel like if you can establish a really good foundation with an athlete, like then once you start adding, the specificity and the speed and, the intensity, that they can go really far. One thing that like, I guess a thing that I always like to say is your peak is as high as your base is long. And I'm like, so, if you build a base like this and you flip it, your peak's going to be that high. You build a base this, and you flip it, your peak's going to be that high. And so like, really building that core foundation, which is actually kind of fun this time of the year. It's really like, what we're doing. Like I would say, like, in fact, I had a meeting with an athlete earlier today after our swim workout. And I was like, we are in the thick of it, in the thick of the foundation work. I was like, fatigue is high, hours are high, numbers are big and all that type of stuff. I was like, but we're going to start seeing, these numbers are actually that foundation phase. We're going to start moving out of that. And then, you have to get more adjusted to the hours being a little bit less, but the intensity then is going to start picking it up and everything. But I feel like that foundation, in order to be great, and this is what I'll say, in order to be great, you have to build that foundation properly and then add the intensity. I do see some people making the mistake, and it's out of boredom, it's out of excitement, even. And my coach used to say this is like in base season, foundation season, he was like, go ride your bike. It's like, well, that's not very exciting. He was like, this isn't exciting. I'm not here to entertain you, and but he'd be like, but what like there are magic things happening, and we can talk about the physiology of what magic happens when you're doing that 1-2 zone work. But I think like some coaches like will get or they just do the same like kind of intensity year in, year out, like 20 or whatever every week of the year and everything. And I do think that training under a method like that, you can be good, and you can be good year round. You know what I mean? But you can't be great. You can't win the really, really big races, which interestingly, like a little side note to that, I think working, with the East African runners, a lot of them, when I first started working with them, they were just chasing races year round and everything. And they were racing really well and everything, and I guess what I'd always say is, they could run a road race every other weekend and win $500. They'd be in the United States for 6 months. They'd make X amount of money and go home. And one thing that I really had to change with their thinking and everything was I'd be like, hey, like, let's kind of get rid of a lot of those $500 wins, which I mean, that's 500 is almost like a metaphor, like the money is like for the importance of the race. And let's go for like, the $100,000 wins, what I mean? Let's not win the Topeka 5K, let's win the Boston Marathon. And, to get them to subscribe to that. And once again, and to do that, you have to lay that foundation. You have to go through the phases of training and really do that to accomplish it. And I think that I would say that's like a big, like kind of core physical, like, thing that I believe in. Yeah.
So let's take the example of maybe not an elite that's been in the sport for 10 years, but also not the example of like an 18-year-old neo-pro who's sort of talented, but, needs that base. So let's talk about, like a pro who's been in the sport for a while, or like an age grouper who is, 40, but has been active in endurance sports for 10 years. Like, how long does setting the foundation take? And of course, it's going to change for everybody, but just like thinking about the different populations, like what kind of time commitment are we talking about to build an effective foundation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of answers to that, and it definitely depends like from athlete to athlete. But I mean, if you're dealing with, like you say, 40-year-old age group, athlete who has been in the sport for 4 or 5 years or something like that, I would say that like they probably do have like a bit of foundation like under them. You know what I mean? If they came to me, I'd have to look and, what have you done and what have you historically been doing and everything to kind of understand it. So, and like some people, I can use a guy almost almost that person. A guy came to me, says, I've been doing this for 3 years, but he was on one of those programs that it was like, oh, you can totally dominate an Ironman with 8 hours of training a week. But what you have to do is you have to eat peanut butter 4 times a day, and then go, shovel a few rocks into a Coke can and rattle it around. All this like really weird, obscure stuff and I was like, listen, man. And I was like, and he was like, so, I feel like I have a bit of foundation. And I was like, you don't. You've been training 6 to 8 hours a week for the past 3 years training for an Ironman. And then you've been DNFing Ironmans for that very reason. You know what I mean? And I was like, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. You're going to have to do, more volume and more aerobic work. And it's not going to be exciting. It's certainly not going to be eating a lot of peanut butter and, putting rocks in cans and stuff like that. It's actually just going to be getting out the door and doing some fundamental training. But whereas on a flip side of that is like if a 40-year-old age group were to come to me and be like, hey, I've been training for the last 5 years, you look at their training, you're like, okay, they've actually put in some volume. Then I'd be like, okay, well, that you don't have to emphasize that as much, and then add on to that. If they're like, yeah, and in high school, I was a runner or a distance runner, then I'd be like, well, you even have to add it less, you know what I mean? Whereas if someone, same thing, comes in 40 years old, never raced before and, came from martial arts or something, I'd be like, okay, we probably need to. But I think the second piece of that equation too is like physiology. And I mean, I'm sure you've seen that with athletes that you coach, initial testing with them, and you're like, oh my gosh, this person is incredibly fast. You know what I mean? They have like speed and man, they can do something for, 100 meters incredibly well. But, I tell them to ride their bike for 2 hours and they're eating 2,000 calories on a 2-hour bike ride and stuff. I'd be like, okay, they're very fast twitch, all that type of stuff. And I would say that athlete, if they're brand new, we really have to focus on the aerobic work. We're really going to have to focus on that. Whereas the opposite can happen, and I'm sure it's happened with you before, is like you meet an athlete who they actually don't have an endurance sports background, but you tell them to go ride 5 hours on their bike and they're like, yeah, no problem. And they go do it and they're totally fine and they can do it on few calories because they're just naturally fat burners and they have slow twitch metabolism. They're super, aerobic in general. And I think like, those athletes, then I'd be like, okay, well, actually what we do need to, your foundation is just genetically there a bit more. And then actually with those athletes, it'd be like, we have to work on actually getting you to turn over a bit faster and stuff. So I think it's so dependent on the athlete and understanding the athlete, their background, even their physiology.
Yeah, this is totally going to get into our question about like AI coaching and stuff, because you started bringing up some of like the other stuff we see in the coaching landscape.
Yeah.
But one thing you said a few minutes ago, you sort of said, okay, there's like a 10-year plan. There's maybe like a 3 to 5 year, and then like this season, this mesocycle, and like this week.
Yeah.
And, if you're planning that sort of bigger perspective, what are the metrics you look at, whether they are like objective, like, okay, X athlete can do these watts for this amount of time, so we're moving on.
Yeah.
And then what are some of the like subjective ones that you look at where you're like, okay, I know that we're headed in the right direction. And so, my question there is basically like, what are the signposts that you look for along the way to know that you and the athlete are headed to where you want to get?
Well, I think a big piece of that is identifying super clear goals on the front end. You know what I mean? And then you can create those signposts. And that's like you said, and I mean, using an example is if we'll take for our 40-year-old age grouper again, you know what I mean? If you want to qualify for, the Ironman, you're starting now and you want to qualify for the Hawaii Ironman, Kona Ironman World Championships in 3 years, like these are the numbers as a 40-year-old that you're going to have to get to. And then it's pretty easy at that point. I can be like, okay, over the next 3 years, like this is a logical progression. This is what we want to be hitting. And like, it's a fun example too, because it's like, oh, well, within 6 months, you were hitting what you have to on the swim. So let's just put that where it is. You know what I mean? And kind of like, but on the bike, you are so far off. You know what I mean? So that's where the emphasis is going to be. And then you can it's kind of easy to create the roadmap, like for whatever. I think the hard part is, as you know, if an athlete comes to you and is like, I have no foundation or no background, and I want to qualify for Kona in 6 months, then
this year.
that's where I
Yeah.
have to be like, well, it's actually, let's look at the roadmap that it takes to get there and how accelerated this roadmap would have to be, which is unrealistic and that type of thing. So I think it is like identifying the goals with an athlete and then creating whatever to accomplish those goals and being realistic about it and everything, which sometimes people don't. People struggle with, like, because patience is hard. And I think that's a hard part about endurance sports too. But I also think it's one thing that's highly addictive, like about triathlon, is like you can see the progress over time, but it's not like a talent sport that you're, like I said, it takes time. I always say distance runners were like, just like Rome, distance runners were not built in a day. You know what I mean? Great distance runners. And same thing goes for triathletes, is like, it takes time. And I think like, if, as long as you can get people like to subscribe to that, especially if they're new to the sport, then they see that. But I think that's the addictive thing about the sport too, is each race you see so much improvement, but you also see the mistakes that you made and how you can improve on those mistakes, especially over the course of an Ironman. You know what I mean? I don't think I've ever talked to anyone in my entire life for an Ironman that was like, you know what? I did everything absolutely right.
And like everything unfolded the way that we talked about it.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
like the weather
And
was
everything happened
perfect.
exactly the way that I thought it was going to happen. So, and I think that's an addictive thing about the sport, because you almost every time when you finish, you cross the finish line, you're like, hey, wow, there's so much more I could do to get better and to make myself better and everything. But I think like being honest with the person on the front end too, of, what does that take and what does it look like, and establishing that like over that period. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I think it's like, like kind of the creating an appropriate time and plan for what a specific person wants to accomplish, and both with objective goals for sure. You know what I mean? I guess getting to the subjective part of it is like, just kind of like, are you ticking these, that's where I would say the art of it comes in a little bit more, whereas what subjectively do I see with this person that we kind of need to, like a hurdle that we need to, get over in order for them to continue to be successful, to hit their actual, like, objective goals, and like, and how do we like, and how can we assess that, the subjective piece of it, which is sometimes hard, as you know. I mean, it's like, yeah, and I would say triathletes too, objective goals, no problem. They get that. The numbers, they're like 100%. You tell me I need to hit 240 watts, then I get that. Whereas like subjective, it's a lot harder, Yeah.
One of the things we talked about in December, which was so great, is we chatted a little bit about just like, what are the way that the coaching landscape has changed. And like, what do you think are some of the challenges that are facing, like a high performance coach like you right
Mhm.
now?
I mean, this is not unique. Just time, like time. Like I really wish that like I had, more time to, and energy and everything to spend like with each individual athlete, and it's funny. I would say a conundrum of a daily training environment, like, and we'll just talk about that specifically, is that like it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy, but it wouldn't function nearly as well if there were less people in it, if that makes
Right.
sense,
Yeah.
because it is this like symbiotic environment. So like, let's use an example of like 12 people is like, the 12 people, like they're all symbiotically working together. And if it were only 6 of them or only 4 of them, it might not grow, as well and symbiotically work together or get as powerful. But the amount of time that it takes to like manage, like, that many people, that like intimate and like professional of an environment, like, is, sometimes a challenge. And I would say that's like just normal. Actually, like, I often think, and it's kind of interesting with like a football coach, an NCAA football coach. I mean, they have like 85 guys on the team. I mean, I think that's like a unique like challenge, you know what I mean? But I think that it's also, they're working together as a team, so you're coaching as a team. In triathlon, the challenge is like I said, I have 12 athletes who are individuals, and they're working as individuals and they're training as individuals. You know what I mean? Like, I would say that's the challenge. There's interesting, another piece I think that's challenging is now we are inundated with information. Athletes are inundated with information, of which 90% of it is total crap and noise. You know what I mean? And it is just noise. But me, as coaches, like our job is to sift through that and then determine, what is noise and what isn't noise, and then grabbing onto the 10% that's not and actually embracing it and learning it and taking advantage of it and everything, and actually trying to shield the athletes from that. You know what I mean? Because they don't have the time or emotional energy to, and I would say that's what's changed a lot. You know what I mean? You log on today and you go on AI or I mean, just Google something like, there's 15 different answers to one question and they're all completely different. You know what I mean? And understand, and you can rebut any research with some other research. You know what I mean? That says something completely different. And I think, and products too. I mean, there's always new products. Like, I mean, from nutrition to recovery to whatever that is claiming. This is the next best thing. And if you take this, one supplement. I mean, this is the new supplement that everyone's taking. That if you take it, determining like as coaches, once again, our job is okay, is that legit? I need to look at the research. And I think that's changed a lot just because we have access to so much information and everything, and I think it's interesting because you mentioned AI, I mean, there's two pieces of that. AI makes mistakes still, which is interesting too. And it cites resources that don't exist and, stuff like that. But I also think AI, talking about coaching, and is that an effective way? In some ways, this is what I would say, as far as, especially with athletes that you're working with one-on-one and you want to get the most and best out of it, 80% of their success is our relationship. You know what I mean? 20% of the success is the program that's being written. And I can tell you that if I were to go to one of my pros and say, hey, listen, AI is going to coach you now. So, and it knows it's totally good at analyzing, what you're doing. It's going to take today's workout and tell you what you need to be doing next week based on what you accomplished today. I would be coaching them for about 2 more days. And then they'd be like, I'm going to go get a coach that can help me. They're like, but that's not to say that there isn't value potentially in that. You know what I mean? And that's what I see in the future, me using it as more of a tool to help with analysis, quicker analysis on what is. But I can tell you too, is I mean, that's the hard part of coaching people is every person is so different, and the example of having 12 people in a group, each of them tomorrow will respond differently to the same workout that we're doing. They're doing similar workouts over the past month, because someone might have just not a great day. Someone maybe didn't feel quite properly before. Someone maybe just broke up with their boyfriend. All of those human tangible factors. I guess, if AI in the future, you can be and this person broke up with their boyfriend, this morning, and then, ate a little bit more of a breakfast than normal, and also probably swam a little bit too hard, and, and also, just happened to wake up on the wrong side of bed and their Whoop score was this. And, there's so many human factors involved that I think taking that out of coaching is definitely ignoring a huge part of the equation. But maybe, or, using AI to help with the analysis and or the assessment of training there could be some potential, value there and everything. So, and it is, I mean, the way I use it, I mean, AI, even as a coach is hey, just read about this, vet this idea, vet this concept.
Yeah, totally.
And, and sometimes it will, and, and sometimes it will affect, I'm oh my gosh, that just saved me 8 hours. You know what I mean? And other times I'm okay, this, I don't know. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah. Cause I mean, the thing you're basically talking about is the difference between a human consciousness, AI is amazing, obviously, and sort of this incredible thing, but it still can't assimilate a lifetime of an individual experience. And that's sort of the problem with AI is it's assimilating a massive experience.
Yeah, for sure. It is. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Not an individual. Yeah. It's a bunch of individuals, which it then lumped into for
right,
sure.
into one. And you're well, this athlete is not, indicative of the mean, of the average. And it's our job as coaches is to coach the single person who's in front of us, even if there are 12 people in front of us, which I think is the huge challenge is okay, I've got to keep all of these people.
And this is the example I like to use too, in that regard is I can go up to those 12 people tomorrow and line them up and say, how are you feeling? And all of them, all 12 of them can look me in the eye and say, okay, I'm okay. I'm okay means 12 very different things to those 12 different people. I always say to one person that may mean they're on their deathbed, like they're just like they can barely move, and they shouldn't have got out of bed that morning. And another one, I'm okay, means that they're ready to win a world championship. And I think that's it too, and knowing that, like knowing that person and knowing what I'm okay means and looking into their eyes and understanding what their eyes are telling you, that's like invaluable. I think that's where, like, obviously, like, AI, like, it does not have that component. I do think, like, you're not, if someone's like, hey, I want to do my first triathlon, and, I'm going to like use AI to do that. Like, I'd be like, that's fine. You know what I mean? Like, in fact, like, you're probably going to get pretty good advice. Like, and once again, and you can probably have a good result, but if you want to be, at the top of your game and like optimal, then, I think that you need more than that for sure. You need a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. It sort of feels like AI is going to replace the kind of like canned training plans that have
For
been out
sure.
there,
Yeah,
for
it's
20
bulk
years.
training plan. I 100% agree. That's
Yeah.
a good way to put it. Yeah.
And feels like a good use where you're like, I mean, a lot of times people like ask me about my business and they're like, oh, there must be tons of triathletes. And you're like, well, USA Triathlon's membership is X. There are 50 states. There are, and out of the triathlon population, like maybe 25% actually want a coach or in a place
Yeah.
where they
Yeah.
want a coach. And so pretty quickly you're like, no, our customer base is like 1,000 people and that's it.
Yeah. Right.
Like,
Exactly.
and for the other people who don't need a coach, I do feel like, okay, AI is going to probably give them something that's not going to hurt them.
Right.
And
And
you're
I
like,
think maybe
that's
an
not a bad
advantage
place
of
to start.
AI over like bulk training plans, like what you talked about before, is it's like bulk training plans, like they do like problem with that is it uploads into Training Peaks, let's say, you know what I mean? And then you're 4 days into this bulk training program. That's a 6-month training program. And your kid gets sick and you have to skip a workout. Then you're like, okay, what do I do now? Then do I just hop on back on the plan? And then, okay, what if I miss a week? Then, then do I have to make up a week? And, and then if I miss a month, then, how do I do that? Whereas I think that like what AI can do that kind of like is better than that is it can be like, hey, you missed yesterday, so I'm going to readjust, you know what I mean? And so that could be, like more of a value of maybe a bulk plan there and everything. And I mean, and kind of like what you just said, I would say another positive is if it's helping more athletes like get into the sport and makes it more accessible, then fantastic. You know what I mean? Because I think it's only good for like everyone. And I mean, I just believe in the sport, like from just like being a healthy, place to be that. I mean, the more athletes that are doing triathlon, the better, I love to see that. So yeah.
All right, we can get you out the door in a few minutes, but one of my favorite quotes that I have parroted of yours is metabolic efficiency is just another phrase for getting fit.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
I love that quote. And every time I get a chance to hear you talk about it, I want to give you a chance to like unpack that because I really do think it's one of the things that like is so misunderstood in our sport. So could you talk a little bit about what that quote of yours means and why you're so committed to it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's because when you look at like what's happening to a body physiologically when it is getting fit, it is basically just you are getting metabolically more efficient. Your body is learning to use substrates more effectively, more efficiently, over longer periods of time. And that's so like, it's just, you're learning your body's using fat at higher levels of, output and everything. I mean, that's what getting fit is. When you look at like, like a threshold test, what is a threshold test? I mean, one of the biggest things that they measure in that test is your RER, which is your for exchange ratio. When that hits 1.0 is the number, that means you're in 100% sugar metabolism. That's kind of when you're coming, threshold into, beyond that and everything. So when you can move that to a faster pace or a bigger wattage, if you can move that number up, it's, that old one's over here. You're just getting more metabolically efficient. That's the only thing. That's what's happening. I mean, that's what fitness is. So yeah, it's funny because I do think it's been like maybe discussed a little bit too much. Hold on a sec. I've got a little persnickety visitor. You can see this.
Nice. Yeah, my guy was arfing a little while ago as well.
Yeah. Um, but I think, people have like, it's funny because when you talk about all those things, it's like it's such a conversation too, like in endurance sports right now. And I feel like we're now in this like high carbohydrate phase. How many calories can you take in, per hour still, and your gut can process but same thing is the less hard you're working or the less hard your body perceives it's working, the higher ability it has to take in a good amount of calories. You know what I mean? And the harder you're working, the less you have that ability, which once again, if you can train that, it's just becoming metabolically more efficient once again. But I think also people have took it to the other extreme where, there was you need to train your body just to burn fat. And I think it's not totally A, possible, but B, you can make yourself more efficient that way. Also, I mean, sugar is the fuel that we run on, and so you have to learn how to use that and process that as well. I mean, when you're talking about sprint distance racing, Olympic distance racing, I mean, the gun goes off and you are in 100% sugar metabolism,
The whole time, yeah.
Whereas an Ironman, honestly, you want to stay out of that as much as you possibly can for as long as you possibly can. You want to train your body to stay out of it for as long as you can and be, once again, working at the highest level. So anyway, kind of a long answer of all that, but it is, I mean, it is when people talk about it, I'm like, it's basically metabolic efficiency is a term for just getting more and more fit. Yeah. Or the fittest athletes in the world are also the metabolically most efficient ones. Yeah.
And it's like, it's such a tautology because it's like, well, they're metabolically efficient because they put in the time to do the work and do the training, not because they are eating avocados all the time.
Right. No, exactly.
Like, yeah.
Exactly. And that is exactly. Yeah. Right. And it's funny that you mentioned that because I could see that there's going to be some fat or something that's like, you don't have to train anymore. There's actually a way of eating that you can make yourself more metabolically efficient. And people will be like, oh, really? Well, then I'm not going to train and I'm just going to eat avocados all day and it's going to be amazing. But yeah, it's a common theme with training that my college coach, he always said, here, and he was a funny guy in the way that he talked, but he says, here, we have a philosophy. It's the KISS philosophy. And he's like, it's keep it simple. And, you've heard keep it simple. And he's like, it's keep it simple, stupid. It's like, and he was like, we just keep it simple. And I do think like, and we were just talking about that earlier, there's so much noise and everything. And it's so easy to get caught up in like all of these like, far-fetched ideas and this new magic pill and all this stuff. But I think we are learning stuff and the science is changing and training is changing, but it's more at a, very like progressive and slow pace. It's not like all of a sudden. And I always tell people if there's some new product or some new philosophy that happens, that's really game changing, it's going to change overnight. You know what I mean? But if it's not, if it's like, and we are, like I said, I feel like we are becoming like, better coaches. There is more access to ideas and stuff, but there's no like magic pills. And I think like that's an important thing to like discuss with athletes. Like ultimately it's like, it's training smart and, and hard and, kind of like ticking the boxes and everything, but it's normally not like, there's not this, new magic thing or everything, which I think a lot of people like are really often looking for that. But like I said, the most successful athletes that I've seen are the ones who just understand that they just need to show up every day. They don't have to hit home runs every day at all. They just need to show up every day, stay healthy, stay consistent. And those are the athletes that ultimately end up becoming the most successful.
Can't think of a better place to finish than that. That is
good.
Awesome. Where can people follow you, see what you're up to, follow your athletes, check in about where everything's going on? Yeah. What are the best ways to observe your world?
Yeah, well, I'm horrible at social media and I don't do it very much. We do, our coaching group, Endurance Sports Training, has Instagram, Facebook. My Instagram is at Coach Ryan Bolton. And we actually, yeah, like I said, I can maybe get a post up every 6 weeks or so. But it's easy. And I think we all do this on Instagram and stuff. It's like for posting stories and stuff. So like following that stuff is easy. But honestly, I always just encourage people like to, follow the athletes that I work with and everything. And I mean, it's easy to like follow what I do to see who, those athletes are and everything. Also, USA Triathlon does a good job now with their like their elite pages and everything. And those are covering like a lot of the athletes that I'm directly working with, which is fun. So yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time. It's always good to see you. It's always fun to hear what you're up to and everything like that. And yeah, thank you for visiting, being a guest lecturer at the infirmary.
Yeah, yeah, no, thanks, Chris. Last time I think I saw you in person was in Tucson, and we need to get you back down here.
I would love to. Yeah, yeah, that would be awesome. But good luck with the rest of your time down there, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, bud.